September 12, 1943. The cramped quarters of the flagship Yamato, somewhere in the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita sat motionless at his desk, staring at the intelligence report that had just been delivered by his aide. The single sheet of paper trembled slightly in his weathered hands, not from fear, but from the weight of comprehension settling into his bones like cold seawater. The numbers were impossible, yet they were real. Verified by multiple sources, confirmed by photographic reconnaissance, cross-referenced with intercepted American radio traffic. In the 18 months since the disaster at Midway, the Americans had commissioned 23 new aircraft carriers. 23. The Imperial Japanese Navy, straining every resource of a nation pushed to its industrial limits, had managed to complete 4. The mathematics of this war had become a death sentence written in steel and rivets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kurita reached for his tea, now cold, and forced himself to drink it anyway. The bitter taste matched his thoughts perfectly. Around him, the Yamato's massive superstructure hummed with the vibration of her engines, this floating city of steel that represented Japan's greatest achievement in naval architecture. 72,000 tons of battleship, the largest ever constructed, armed with 9 18-inch guns that could hurl a shell weighing as much as a small car over 25 miles. She was magnificent. She was obsolete. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Kurita had known this truth for longer than he cared to admit. His aide, Lieutenant Commander Yushiro Nakamura, stood at attention near the door, waiting for orders that both men knew would make no difference to the eventual outcome. Nakamura was young, barely 30, a graduate of the Naval Academy, who still possessed the fierce optimism that older officers had long since abandoned. He believed in Bushido, in the warrior spirit, in the notion that superior will could overcome material disadvantage. Kurita had believed these things once, a lifetime ago, before he had seen what American industrial capacity could actually produce when fully mobilized. The report lay on his desk like an accusation. Essex-class carriers rolling off American shipyards at a rate of 1 per month. Independence-class light carriers being converted from cruiser hulls in a matter of weeks. Destroyer escorts, submarines, landing craft, cargo ships, tankers, all being produced in quantities that defied rational comprehension. The Americans were building an entire navy while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war, supplying the British and Soviets with equipment, and maintaining a civilian economy that continued to function normally. It was obscene. It was unstoppable. Kurita's career had spanned 3 decades of naval service, beginning in the era when battleships represented the ultimate expression of national power, when a dreadnought on the horizon could cow an entire region into submission. He had watched the evolution of carrier aviation with the skepticism of an officer trained in gunnery and surface warfare, had slowly come to understand that aircraft had fundamentally altered the nature of naval combat, and had finally accepted, somewhere around the time of Midway, that the age of the battleship had ended even as Japan was completing the greatest battleships ever built. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. Japan had spent years designing and constructing the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, pouring resources into these magnificent dinosaurs while the future of naval warfare was being written in the skies above carrier decks. The Americans, meanwhile, had grasped this fundamental truth earlier and committed their industrial base to producing carriers in quantities that would have seemed like fantasy just 5 years ago. Now those carriers were hunting Japanese ships across the Pacific, their aircraft striking with impunity, their numbers growing while Japan's carrier force withered under losses that could not be replaced. Kurita rose from his chair and moved to the porthole, looking out at the gray expanse of the Philippine Sea. Somewhere out there, American submarines prowled the shipping lanes, slowly strangling Japan's economy by sinking the tankers and freighters that carried the resources Japan desperately needed. Somewhere beyond the horizon, American carriers operated with the confidence of a force that knew it had already won, that understood the war's outcome was now just a matter of time and casualties. The question was no longer whether Japan would lose, but how much more destruction would occur before the inevitable surrender. The transformation had begun slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the months following Pearl Harbor. At first, the string of Japanese victories had seemed to validate every assumption about Japanese superiority in training, tactics, and fighting spirit. The Philippines fell, Hong Kong surrendered, Singapore, Britain's great fortress in the east, capitulated in what Churchill would later call the worst disaster in British military history. The Dutch East Indies with its precious oil fields came under Japanese control. Burma, Malaya, Wake Island, Guam, all fell to Japanese forces that seemed invincible. But even during those heady days of conquest, when Japan's empire expanded to encompass territory stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, perceptive officers like Kurita had understood the fundamental problem. Japan was not winning a war. Japan was racing against time, trying to seize enough territory, fortify enough positions, and inflict enough damage on American will that the United States would negotiate a settlement rather than pay the price of total victory. Admiral Yamato himself had warned the government before the war began that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but that he had utterly no confidence in Japan's ability to win a protracted conflict against American industrial might. Yamato had been right, of course. He was dead now, shot down by American fighters in April based on intelligence that suggested the Americans were reading Japanese communications with disturbing accuracy. His loss had been devastating to Japanese morale, but more devastating still was what his death represented. The Americans could reach out and eliminate Japan's greatest naval strategist with surgical precision. They could decode messages, position fighters, and execute operations that demonstrated a level of intelligence capability and operational coordination that Japan simply could not match. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had been the turning point, though many officers had refused to accept this reality at the time. 4 fleet carriers lost in a single day, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all sunk with their experienced pilots and maintenance crews. Japan's carrier force had been gutted in 6 minutes of American dive bomber attacks that caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. The loss was catastrophic, but what made it truly devastating was Japan's inability to recover. Kurita had not been at Midway. He had been commanding a cruiser division supporting operations in the Aleutian Islands, a diversionary attack that accomplished nothing while the main carrier force sailed into disaster. He had learned of the defeat through fragmentary radio reports that grew increasingly desperate as the day progressed, then through the grim official announcements that tried to minimize the scale of the catastrophe. 4 carriers lost, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots dead. The myth of Japanese invincibility shattered against the rocks of American determination and superior intelligence. The months following Midway had revealed the true nature of the challenge Japan faced. While Japan struggled to build replacement carriers, converting merchant ships and rushing incomplete designs into service, the Americans had activated an industrial mobilization that defied comprehension. The Essex-class carrier program, authorized before the war began, started producing ships at a rate that seemed impossible. Each Essex-class carrier was larger than Japan's fleet carriers, carried more aircraft, possessed better damage control systems, and came equipped with radar that gave American forces a technological advantage in night operations and bad weather. But it was not just carriers. American submarines, initially hampered by defective torpedoes, had solved their technical problems and were now waging unrestricted warfare against Japanese merchant shipping with devastating effectiveness. Japan's economy depended absolutely on imported resources. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, all had to be transported by sea to the home islands. American submarines were sinking tankers faster than Japan could build replacements, slowly strangling the industrial base that sustained the war effort. Kurita had seen the statistics. In 1942, American submarines had sunk roughly 500,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. In 1943, that number would exceed 1.5 million tons. Japanese shipyards, already operating at maximum capacity to replace naval losses, could not begin to match these figures. Every tanker sunk meant less fuel for training pilots. Every freighter sent to the bottom meant fewer resources for manufacturing aircraft. The submarine campaign was a garrote slowly tightening around Japan's throat, and there was no effective counter. The American approach to naval warfare had evolved with frightening speed. Their early tactical mistakes, the losses at Savo Island and other engagements where Japanese night fighting expertise had prevailed, had been studied, analyzed, and countered. American ships now carried radar that allowed them to fight effectively at night. American doctrine had adapted to emphasize the advantages they possessed in industrial capacity and technological innovation. American training programs were producing pilots in quantities that Japan could never hope to match. This last point haunted Kurita more than any other. Japan's pre-war pilot training program had been excellent, producing aviators with hundreds of hours of flight time and extensive combat experience from operations in China, but that training pipeline was extremely narrow, designed for peacetime operations, incapable of rapid expansion. When experienced pilots died, as they inevitably did in combat, they could not be quickly replaced. Japan had begun the war with approximately 3,500 naval aviators. By late 1943, the majority of those men were dead, and their replacements were flying into combat with a fraction of the training their predecessors had received. The Americans, meanwhile, had created a pilot training infrastructure that was producing aviators in industrial quantities. Flight schools across the American mainland were graduating thousands of pilots who would then receive specialized carrier training before being assigned to combat units. These pilots might not have the individual skill level of Japan's pre-war aviators, but they had enough training to be effective. They came in overwhelming numbers, and they were supported by aircraft that were rapidly improving in quality. Kurita pulled the intelligence report closer and read it again, hoping somehow the numbers might have changed. They had not. The report detailed American carrier operations in the Gilbert Islands, where a new pattern of warfare was emerging. Multiple carrier task forces operating in coordination, their combined air wings capable of launching strikes involving hundreds of aircraft. Fighter sweeps that overwhelmed Japanese air defenses through sheer numbers, bombing attacks that suppressed airfields and destroyed Japanese aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. It was a new form of naval warfare, one where American material superiority could be applied with crushing effect. The report also contained information about American shipbuilding capacity that seemed almost fantastical. In addition to the Essex-class fleet carriers, the Americans were producing Independence-class light carriers by converting Cleveland-class cruiser hulls. These light carriers were smaller, faster, carried fewer aircraft, but could be completed in a fraction of the time required for fleet carriers.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The Americans were building them simultaneously with the Essex-class ships, creating a two-tier carrier force that would soon number in the dozens. Beyond carriers, the Americans were producing destroyers at a rate of multiple ships per week. Destroyer escorts, smaller and cheaper than fleet destroyers but perfectly adequate for convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare, were being launched in even greater numbers. The Americans were solving their merchant shipping needs by producing Liberty ships, basic cargo vessels that could be constructed in under 2 months using prefabricated sections and welding techniques that eliminated the need for skilled riveters. These Liberty ships were ugly, slow, and prone to structural problems, but they were adequate for their purpose, and they could be produced faster than German U-boats could sink them in the Atlantic. This same industrial capacity was now being directed at Japan. Every weapons system the Americans deployed was backed by production facilities that could replace losses overnight. Every ship sunk, every aircraft destroyed, every tank knocked out, all would be replaced multiple times over. Japan's industrial base, stretched thin by the demands of a war across thousands of miles of ocean, could not keep pace, could not even come close. Kurita remembered the optimism of December 1941, the belief that a decisive blow against the American Pacific Fleet would give Japan the time needed to consolidate its conquests and fortify a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to breach. The strategy had been based on assumptions that now seemed almost childishly naive: the assumption that America lacked the will for a protracted war, the assumption that Japanese defensive positions would be impregnable, the assumption that Japan's qualitative superiority in training and tactics would offset American quantitative advantages. All of these assumptions had proven false. American will, far from being weak, had been strengthened by Pearl Harbor. The attack that was supposed to intimidate America into accepting Japanese dominance in the Pacific had instead unified American public opinion behind total war. The industrial mobilization that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Factories that had produced automobiles were now building tanks, and shipyards that had constructed a handful of vessels per year were now launching ships weekly. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling positions left vacant by men who had joined the military. The entire American economy had transformed into a war machine of terrifying efficiency. Japanese defensive positions, meanwhile, were proving less impregnable than hoped. American forces had developed techniques for bypassing strongly held islands, cutting them off from supply and reinforcement, rendering them irrelevant while American forces advanced past them toward Japan itself. This island-hopping strategy, combined with submarine warfare that interdicted Japanese supply lines, meant that garrisons on isolated islands slowly withered from lack of supplies while American forces concentrated on objectives that actually mattered strategically. The qualitative superiority of Japanese forces had eroded rapidly. Early in the war, Japanese pilots with years of training and combat experience had dominated American opponents who were learning on the job. But combat is an unforgiving teacher, and American pilots who survived their first engagements rapidly improved. By mid-1943, American pilots were holding their own against Japanese aviators, and American aircraft were improving with each new model. The F-6F Hellcat fighter, introduced in early 1943, was specifically designed to counter the Japanese Zero, and it was proving devastatingly effective. The Hellcat was faster, better armed, better protected, and available in quantities that allowed American carriers to operate with air wings that significantly outnumbered their Japanese counterparts. Nakamura cleared his throat softly, reminding Kurita of his presence. The young officer's face showed concern, perhaps wondering if the admiral had forgotten he was there. Kurita gestured to a chair, and Nakamura sat, his posture remaining formally correct despite the invitation to relax. "Tell me honestly, Nakamura," Kurita said quietly, "what do you think when you read reports like this? Do you believe we can still win this war?" Nakamura hesitated, choosing his words carefully. A direct question from a superior officer demanded a direct answer, but speaking certain truths aloud could be dangerous. The military police were everywhere, watching for defeatism, for any suggestion that ultimate victory was not assured. But Kurita's expression suggested he wanted honesty, not propaganda. "I believe, sir, that the spirit of our forces remains strong. Our training emphasizes qualities that numbers cannot measure. We fight for the emperor, for our homeland, for principles that give us strength beyond mere material calculations." It was a careful answer, technically correct according to official doctrine, but Kurita detected the uncertainty beneath the formal phrasing. Nakamura was intelligent enough to see the same things Kurita saw, but young enough to still hope that somehow the mathematics of industrial war might be overcome by superior will. "Those are the words we are supposed to believe," Kurita said, not unkindly. "But I asked what you think, not what doctrine tells you to think. We are alone in this cabin. Whatever you say will remain between us. I need to understand how younger officers view our situation." Nakamura's shoulders sagged slightly, the formal military bearing relaxing into something more human. When he spoke again, his voice carried genuine feeling rather than official optimism. "I think, sir, that we are fighting a war we cannot win through conventional means. The Americans have too many resources, too much industrial capacity, too much of everything. Every battle we fight, even when we achieve tactical victories, depletes our forces in ways we cannot replace. The Americans lose ships and aircraft and men, and then they build more ships, more aircraft, and train more men. We lose ships and aircraft and men, and we struggle to replace any of it. The mathematics are against us." Kurita nodded slowly. It was the most honest assessment he had heard from a junior officer in months. Most either genuinely believed the propaganda, or were too afraid to voice doubts. Nakamura's willingness to speak openly suggested an intelligence that might be valuable in the difficult times ahead. "You are correct, of course," Kurita said. "The Americans have activated an industrial base that we cannot match. Did you know that before the war, the United States was producing more steel in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year? That their automobile industry alone was larger than our entire industrial economy? We went to war with a nation that possessed 10 times our economic capacity, and we did so believing that spirit and training would somehow overcome these material disadvantages." Nakamura absorbed this information silently. These were figures that were rarely discussed openly, truths that contradicted the official narrative of inevitable Japanese victory. "Then why do we continue fighting, sir? If the outcome is certain, why not seek peace now, before more lives are lost?" It was a dangerous question, one that could be interpreted as defeatism, but Kurita had opened this conversation, and he owed the young officer an honest response. "Because the alternative is surrender, and our nation's leadership cannot accept surrender. Because we hope that by making the cost of victory high enough, the Americans might agree to a negotiated peace that preserves something of our position. Because we are military officers, and our duty is to fight until ordered to stop, regardless of our personal assessments of the war's outcome. And perhaps because we still hope for a miracle, for some unexpected development that might change the calculus in our favor." Kurita stood and moved to a wall chart showing the Pacific Theater. Red markers indicated Japanese-held territory, an empire that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Blue markers showed American positions, gradually advancing, gradually tightening the noose. The trajectory was unmistakable. "Look at this carefully, Nakamura. In December 1941, we held everything from the Chinese coast to Wake Island, from the Aleutians to the Dutch East Indies. Now, less than 2 years later, the Americans are advancing through the Solomon Islands. They have secured bases in New Guinea. They are preparing to assault the Marshall Islands. Each advance brings them closer to the home islands, and each advance is supported by more carriers, more aircraft, more ships than the previous operation." He traced a line across the map with his finger, following the path of America. "The Americans are not trying to recapture every island we took. They are selecting strategic objectives that allow them to advance while bypassing our strongest positions. They take an island, build an airfield, use that airfield to support the next advance. Meanwhile, their submarines are sinking our merchant fleet faster than we can replace it. We are being strangled economically while simultaneously being pushed back militarily. It is a two-pronged strategy, and we have no effective counter to either element." Nakamura studied the map, his expression showing the same grim recognition that Kurita felt. The visual representation made the trajectory even clearer than statistics alone could convey. Japan's defensive perimeter was contracting, American forces were advancing, and nothing suggested this trend would reverse. "What will happen when they reach the home islands, sir?" Kurita had thought about this question extensively. The answer was too terrible to contemplate, yet too obvious to ignore. "They will invade, or they will blockade us until we starve, or they will bomb our cities until we surrender. Perhaps all three. The Americans have no reason to accept anything less than unconditional surrender. We attacked them without a declaration of war. We mistreated their prisoners. We invaded territories they considered under their protection. They will demand complete submission, and they have the power to enforce that demand." He returned to his desk, suddenly feeling the weight of his years. Kurita was 55 years old, had given his entire adult life to the Imperial Japanese Navy, and was now watching that institution face destruction at the hands of an enemy whose power grew stronger each day. The report on his desk represented not just statistics, but the end of an era. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had defeated Russia in 1905, which had been a major power in world affairs for 4 decades, was being systematically destroyed by a nation that had been a latecomer to naval power. The Americans had learned quickly, had adapted faster, and had applied industrial methods to naval warfare in ways that Japan had never imagined possible. There would be more battles, of course. Japan would fight for every island, every mile of ocean, every inch of homeland soil. Japanese sailors and soldiers would display the courage and fighting spirit that had been drilled into them through years of harsh training. But courage alone could not sink carriers that were never in gun range. Fighting spirit could not shoot down aircraft that outnumbered you 5 to 1. Bushido could not overcome the mathematics of industrial war. Kurita picked up his pen and began drafting his response to the intelligence report. His superiors would want reassurance, optimistic assessments, confidence in ultimate victory. He would provide what was expected while knowing that anyone who understood these numbers would reach the same conclusion he had reached. The Americans were unstoppable because they possessed resources that Japan could never match, industrial capacity that Japan could never equal, and a strategic vision that Japan had failed to anticipate. The war was lost. The only questions remaining were how much longer it would take for everyone else to accept this reality, and how many more lives would be sacrificed to preserve the illusion of possible victory. Outside the porthole, the Philippine Sea stretched to the horizon, gray water meeting gray sky in a featureless expanse. Somewhere out there, American forces were preparing their next operation, building more ships, training more pilots, manufacturing more weapons. The machinery of American industrial war was running at full capacity, producing victory through sheer material abundance. And here in the Admiral's cabin aboard the greatest battleship ever built, Takeo Kurita sat writing reports that everyone would read, and no one would truly believe, knowing that history was recording Japan's defeat one sunken ship, one lost aircraft, one futile battle at a time. October 25, 1944. The waters off Samar Island, Philippines. Kurita stood on the bridge of Yamato as his fleet bore down on what appeared to be American escort carriers. And 13 months had passed since that afternoon in his cabin, when he had confronted the reality of Japan's inevitable defeat. Those months had proven every prediction correct. American forces had swept through the Marshall Islands, then the Marianas, establishing bases from which B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese homeland. The Great Marianas, Turkey shoot in June, had destroyed what remained of Japan's trained carrier pilots, with American fighters massacring inexperienced Japanese aviators, in a battle so one-sided, it earned its mocking nickname from American pilots who compared it to hunting turkeys. Now Kurita commanded the center force of Japan's last desperate gamble, Operation Shogo, designed to destroy American invasion forces at Leyte Gulf. His fleet included Yamato, her sister ship Musashi, 3 other battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. It was the most powerful surface force Japan could still muster, sent on a mission that everyone understood was likely suicidal. The plan required Kurita's force to transit the San Bernardino Strait, emerge into the Philippine Sea, and fall upon the American invasion fleet with overwhelming gunfire. It was battleship warfare from a bygone era, a last attempt to use the massive ships Japan had built when surface gunnery still mattered. The previous day had demonstrated how thoroughly the world had changed. American carrier aircraft had found his force in the Philippine Sea, and launched wave after wave of attacks. Musashi, that magnificent symbol of Japanese naval power, had absorbed an impossible amount of punishment. 19 torpedo hits, 17 bomb hits. The great ship had taken hours to die, finally capsizing and sinking with over 1,000 men still aboard. Kurita had watched his colleague, his friend, disappear beneath the waves aboard a battleship that was supposed to be unsinkable. The Americans had proven that no ship, no matter how well armored, could survive concentrated attack. Battleships were obsolete, and Kurita was leading the last of them into a battle they could not win. Yet here he was, having transited San Bernardino Strait during the night, emerged and aborting at dawn to find American walkouts reported carriers, destroy. Reported destroyers, destroyer escorts. If these were the escort carriers supporting the invasion, Kurita's battleships could destroy them with gunfire before American fleet carriers could respond. It was the opportunity the operation had been designed to create. His heavy guns could reach targets that American aircraft would take time to locate and attack. For perhaps 30 minutes, Japan's battleships might prove their worth one final time. Kurita gave the order to engage. Yamato's massive 18-inch guns thundered, hurling shells toward the distant carrier around him. Other battleships and cruisers opened fire, their weapons reaching out across miles of ocean. This was what these ships had been designed for: surface combat at extreme range, the decisive fleet engagement that battleship doctrine had always envisioned. But even as his guns fired, Kurita understood the futility. Even if he sank every carrier, it would change nothing. The Americans would bring more carriers, more aircraft, more of everything. This battle was theater, a dramatic gesture that might inflict temporary damage but could not alter the war's trajectory. The American response was immediate and desperate. Destroyers and destroyer escorts charged directly at his battleships, laying smokescreens and launching torpedoes in suicidal attacks designed to buy time for the carriers to escape. It was extraordinary courage, small ships attacking a force that outgunned them massively, but it created confusion and forced Kurita to maneuver defensively. American aircraft appeared overhead, harassing his ships, forcing his anti-aircraft guns to engage multiple threats simultaneously. The carriers were launching every available aircraft, throwing fighters and bombers into the battle without proper coordination, simply trying to overwhelm his force through sheer numbers. Kurita's ships scored hits. He watched columns of water bracket American ships, saw explosions on carrier flight decks, observed destroyers taking damage from his cruisers' guns. But the American ships refused to stop fighting. Even damaged vessels continued launching aircraft, continued firing, continued maneuvering. The small American force was putting up resistance far beyond what its size suggested possible, and every minute of fighting gave more American carriers time to respond, time to launch massive strikes that would overwhelm his fleet. After 2 hours of chaotic battle with his ships scattered across miles of ocean, low on ammunition, and facing increasing air attacks, Kurita made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He ordered his force to withdraw. The opportunity to destroy the escort carriers was slipping away as they fled south at maximum speed. His ships were taking damage from air attacks that would only intensify. American fleet carriers were certainly vectoring toward his position. If he continued the engagement, his entire force would be destroyed without accomplishing the larger mission of destroying the invasion fleet. The withdrawal through San Bernardino Strait was a nightmare of air attacks and recrimination. Kurita knew his decision would be questioned, that some would call it cowardice, that the opportunity to inflict significant damage on American forces had been abandoned. But he had seen enough of this war to understand tactical realities. His force would have been annihilated by overwhelming American air power within hours. The battleships that represented Japan's greatest naval achievement would have joined Musashi on the ocean floor. The sacrifice would have been dramatic but ultimately meaningless. The Battle of Leyte Gulf became the largest naval engagement in history, fought across multiple areas over several days. Japan committed virtually every remaining major warship to the operation. When it ended, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. American losses were 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort. The mathematics Kurita had studied in that intelligence report 13 months earlier had played out with brutal precision. Kurita survived the war. He was not tried as a war criminal, perhaps because his decision to withdraw at Samar had actually saved lives by avoiding pointless sacrifice. He lived quietly in post-war Japan, rarely speaking publicly about his wartime service. When historians sought him out, asking about his decision to withdraw when American carriers appeared vulnerable, he gave answers that satisfied no one. He had done what he thought necessary given the tactical situation. He had preserved his force when annihilation seemed certain. He had refused to sacrifice men in a gesture that would change nothing. But in private moments, Kurita would remember that afternoon in his cabin aboard Yamato in September 1943, reading intelligence reports that laid out with mathematical precision why American naval power was unstoppable. He had known then that Japan could not win. Every battle fought afterward, including Leyte Gulf, was simply the slow unwinding of an inevitable defeat. The Americans had possessed resources that Japan could never match, industrial capacity that produced ships faster than they could be sunk, and a strategic vision that correctly identified how modern naval warfare would be fought. Japan had built the greatest battleships ever constructed, and sent them to fight a war where battleships no longer mattered. America had built carriers in quantities that overwhelmed Japanese defenses and established control of the seas through air power that could strike from beyond visual range. The transformation of naval warfare had occurred during the war itself, and only one side had possessed the industrial base to adapt and dominate the new paradigm. Kurita died in 1977, taking with him memories of a navy that had once seemed invincible, destroyed by an enemy whose power had been built on assembly lines and sustained by resources Japan never possessed. He had watched the end of the battleship era from the bridge of the greatest battleship ever built, understanding too late that the war had been decided not by courage or tactics, but by steel production, shipyard capacity, and industrial might that Japan could never hope to equal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.